The Greyhound bus idled at the curb in downtown Phoenix, its engine humming with a low, mechanical impatience as the late afternoon heat shimmered off the pavement. It was July 13th, 1986, and the station was exactly what you would expect on a summer Sunday: crowded, loud, chaotic in that uniquely American way that bus terminals seem to perfect. People dragged duffel bags across cracked concrete. Families argued quietly near payphones. Drivers shouted destinations, and somewhere in the noise, a bus schedule slipped behind by a few minutes, then a few more. When the driver finally called out the departure, passengers began filing on board one by one, handing over tickets, climbing the narrow steps, disappearing into the dim interior of the bus. The doors hissed shut. The engine roared louder. And then, without ceremony, the bus pulled away from the curb and merged into traffic. But one passenger, the one who was supposed to be on that bus, never stepped inside. She was a 20-year-old woman named Rochelle Eam, and according to the last person who admitted to seeing her alive, she had been dropped off right there, at that very station, only minutes earlier. She was supposed to be heading back to California, back to her life, back to a future that had only just begun to take shape. Instead, she vanished. No one remembers seeing her buy a ticket. No one remembers seeing her board a bus. No one remembers seeing her leave. And that raises a question that has haunted investigators, family members, and true crime followers for decades. How does a young woman simply disappear in broad daylight from a crowded Greyhound station, without a single confirmed witness? To understand how Rochelle Eam ended up at that station and why she never left it, we need to rewind, not just a few hours, but years, to a relationship that never should have existed, to an obsession that was quietly allowed to grow, and to a man who would become the last known link to her disappearance. Because Rochelle's story does not begin in Phoenix. It begins in San Diego, California, where Rochelle Eam was living in the summer of 1986, standing at the edge of adulthood with the kind of optimism that only comes when you believe your entire life is still ahead of you. She was intelligent, driven, and by all accounts, deeply compassionate. Friends described her as someone who listened more than she spoke, but when she did speak, her words carried weight. She had recently completed paralegal training and was preparing to start a new job, a real career, not a temporary stepping stone, something she had worked hard for and felt genuinely proud of. At just 20 years old, she was already planning her future with clarity and purpose. But Rochelle's life also carried a quiet complication, one that had been present since her teenage years, lingering in the background like a shadow no one took seriously enough. That complication was a man named Robert Yama. Yama was significantly older than Rochelle, old enough to have been firmly established in adulthood while she was still figuring out who she wanted to be. He had once worked as a gardener for her family, which meant his presence in her life was never something she chose freely. It was inherited, normalized, and slowly allowed to evolve into something far more unsettling. Over time, Yama became obsessed with Rochelle, not in a dramatic, immediately alarming way, but in the slow, insidious manner that often goes unnoticed until it's far too late. He inserted himself into her life under the guise of friendship and mentorship, offering help, attention, and eventually control. Phone calls became frequent. His interest became possessive. And while Rochelle tried to maintain distance, those around her would later admit that the imbalance of power, age, experience, authority was impossible to ignore in hindsight. By the summer of 1986, that imbalance had reached a critical point. Rochelle had traveled to Phoenix, Arizona, to visit friends and attend social gatherings, one final stretch of freedom before starting her new job back in California. It should have been a joyful time, a celebration of transition, a pause before responsibility. But Robert Yama was there too, not by coincidence. He had purchased Rochelle's plane ticket to Phoenix himself, a detail that would later become one of the most chilling aspects of the case. It tied her movements directly to him. It placed him firmly at the center of her last known days. And it raised an uncomfortable question investigators would wrestle with for years. Why was this older man so deeply involved in the travel plans of a 20-year-old woman who was trying to build her own life? As Rochelle spent time with friends in Phoenix, Yama's behavior reportedly grew more erratic. Jealous phone calls, attempts to control where she went and who she saw, a constant need to assert presence, even when he wasn't physically there. To those around Rochelle, it was clear she was uncomfortable, but like many young women navigating unwanted attention from an older man, she tried to manage the situation quietly rather than confront it head-on. She didn't know that time was running out, because within 24 hours, Rochelle Eames would be dropped off at a bus station she would never leave, and the man who claimed to help her get home would become the only person who could explain what really happened next. And he never would. To understand what happened to Rochelle Eames, you have to understand the dynamic that shaped her final days, because her disappearance was not the result of a random encounter, a sudden accident, or a crime of opportunity. It was the culmination of a relationship that had been unbalanced from the very beginning, one built on access, authority, and an obsession that was allowed to grow unchecked. Robert Yama had been in Rochelle's life for years. He was not a stranger she met briefly, nor a fleeting acquaintance she could easily avoid. He had once worked for her family as a gardener, which meant his presence was normalized early on. He was trusted, familiar, non-threatening, at least on the surface. But as Rochelle grew older, and as she began to assert independence, Yama's attachment to her deepened in ways that were deeply inappropriate. Friends would later describe his interest as intense and possessive. He inserted himself into her personal life under the guise of concern, often framing his behavior as protective rather than controlling. He wanted to know where she was going, who she was seeing, how long she would be gone. And when he didn't get the answers he wanted, he became agitated. What made this dynamic especially dangerous was the power imbalance. Yama was significantly older, more financially stable, and positioned as a figure of authority in Rochelle's earlier life. Rochelle, on the other hand, was still finding her footing, emotionally, professionally, and socially. Saying no to him wasn't as simple as blocking a number or walking away. He had history with her family. He had leverage, and he knew how to use guilt and obligation to keep himself involved. By July of 1986, Rochelle was actively trying to reclaim control. She had moved to San Diego. She had completed her paralegal training. She had accepted a new job and was preparing to start a future that did not include Robert Yama. To those close to her, it was clear that she was ready to close that chapter of her life, but Yama was not ready to let it end. When Rochelle mentioned traveling to Phoenix to see friends, Yama insisted on helping her make the trip. He offered to buy her plane ticket, framing it as a generous gesture. On the surface, it might have looked like kindness. In reality, it tethered her to him. He knew her schedule. He knew where she would be. And most importantly, he knew when she was supposed to return. Once Rochelle arrived in Phoenix, the tension escalated almost immediately. She attended parties with friends, normal gatherings filled with laughter, music, and people her own age. She was enjoying herself, reconnecting with others, and briefly stepping away from the pressures waiting for her back in California. But even from a distance, Yama's presence loomed. Phone calls came frequently. Some were described as jealous, others as interrogations disguised as concern. He wanted updates. He wanted reassurance. And when Rochelle didn't respond quickly enough, or when her answers weren't detailed enough, his tone reportedly shifted from caring to confrontational. Those who spoke to Rochelle during this time later recalled that she seemed increasingly uneasy. She mentioned feeling watched, controlled, as if no matter how far she traveled, Yama was still hovering just outside her personal space. And then, near the end of her visit, something changed. Instead of flying back to San Diego as planned, Rochelle arranged to return by Greyhound bus. Why she changed her travel plans has never been fully explained. Some believe she wanted distance from Yama, fewer points of control, fewer opportunities for him to insert himself into her movements. Others believe the decision was influenced by an argument, or by finances, or by a desire to leave quietly. What matters most is this. Robert Yama knew about the bus. Not only did he know, he offered to drive her to the station himself. On July 13, 1986, Rochelle packed her belongings and prepared to leave Phoenix. Friends saw her that day. She spoke about going home, about starting her new job, about moving forward. There was no indication that she planned to disappear, run away, or abandon her life. She was excited. She was hopeful. And she was expected back in California within days. According to Robert Yama, he drove Rochelle to the Greyhound station in downtown Phoenix that afternoon. He would later claim that he dropped her off, watched her walk inside, and then left, believing she was safely on her way home. But that version of events would begin to unravel almost immediately. Because while Yama insisted Rochelle boarded that bus, every piece of evidence said she never did. The final day of Rochelle Eames' life, at least as it is officially documented, did not begin with fear or panic. It began the way so many ordinary days do, with plans already made, conversations half finished, and a quiet confidence that tomorrow was waiting. Rochelle woke up in Phoenix on July 13, 1986, knowing this was the day she was supposed to leave. Her time with friends was ending. San Diego was calling her back, and with it came the start of her new job, a milestone she had worked toward for months. The future felt close enough to touch, and to those around her, Rochelle seemed focused and determined, not distressed. She spent part of that morning talking with friends, gathering her belongings, and making arrangements to head to the Greyhound station later that day. Nothing about her behavior suggested she was planning to vanish. She didn't give away possessions. She didn't make cryptic statements. She didn't express fear about traveling alone. In fact, if anything, she appeared relieved. Relieved that the visit was over. Relieved that she was heading home. Relieved that she would soon be beyond the reach of a man whose presence had begun to feel suffocating. But Robert Yama was still involved, and that involvement intensified as the day went on. According to people who spoke with Rochelle during those final hours, Yama had been calling her repeatedly. The tone of the conversations was not playful or affectionate. They were tense, jealous, confrontational. He questioned who she had been spending time with, and why she hadn't been more communicative. At least one friend later recalled Rochelle rolling her eyes, clearly frustrated, but trying to keep the peace. She didn't want a scene. She just wanted to leave. As the afternoon approached, Rochelle prepared for her trip. The Greyhound bus she was scheduled to take would depart from downtown Phoenix later that day, giving her plenty of time to get there, buy a ticket, and settle in for the long ride back to California. And this is where the story narrows, where the timeline tightens, and every minute begins to matter. Robert Yama arrived to drive Rochelle to the station. No one else went with them. No one else witnessed the interaction. According to Yama, the drive was uneventful. He claimed they spoke casually, that there was no argument, no tension, no reason to believe anything was wrong. But that calm narrative clashes sharply with what others described. Friends who saw Rochelle shortly before she left remembered her being uneasy. She reportedly expressed discomfort about Yama's behavior, about his jealousy, and about how closely he monitored her movements. Some believe the decision to take the bus rather than fly was an attempt to create physical and emotional distance, a quiet act of defiance. If that's true, it would mean Rochelle was actively trying to step out from under his control. And that possibility changes everything. Because when they arrived at the Greyhound station, Rochelle was supposed to step into a crowded, public space, a place where nothing bad could happen without someone noticing. According to Robert Yama, that's exactly what she did. He later told police that he dropped Rochelle off near the entrance, watched her walk inside with her belongings, and then drove away. He claimed he assumed she purchased her ticket and boarded the bus without incident. But investigators would soon discover that this story didn't hold up. Greyhound records showed no ticket purchased in Rochelle's name. No employees recalled seeing her. No passengers remembered boarding with her. And perhaps most disturbing of all, surveillance footage, limited as it was in 1986, provided no confirmation that Rochelle ever entered the station. It was as if she had vanished before she ever reached the door. When Rochelle failed to arrive in San Diego, concern quickly turned into panic. Family members waited for calls that never came. Friends checked schedules, assuming delays. But as hours turned into days, it became clear that something was terribly wrong. Rochelle Eam had disappeared, not on a deserted road, not in the wilderness, but in the heart of a busy city, in broad daylight, with one man as the last known person to see her alive. And that man's story was about to face serious scrutiny. Question investigators couldn't escape. If she never boarded the bus, where did she go? The Greyhound station in downtown Phoenix should have been the safest place in Rochelle Eam's entire journey. It was a public hub, loud, crowded, constantly moving. Buses arrived and departed on rigid schedules. Employees worked ticket counters. Drivers checked manifests. Travelers waited shoulder to shoulder, bags at their feet, eyes fixed on departure boards. If Rochelle had been there, truly there, someone should have seen her. But when investigators began peeling back the layers of what happened that afternoon, the picture that emerged was deeply unsettling. Because the station remembered everything, except Rochelle Eam. According to Robert Yama, he pulled up near the entrance, helped Rochelle unload her bags, said a brief goodbye, and watched her walk toward the doors. He claimed there was nothing unusual about the moment. No argument, no hesitation, no sign of distress. Just a routine drop-off. Yet from the very start, police struggled to corroborate even the simplest parts of that story. Greyhound employees were interviewed. Ticket clerks were questioned. Drivers were asked to recall passengers boarding the California-bound buses that afternoon. None of them remembered Rochelle. No one recalled a young woman matching her description buying a ticket, asking questions, or waiting in line. And while memory can be imperfect, this wasn't just one missed detail. It was every detail. Investigators checked ticket records. In 1986, Greyhound tickets were often purchased in person, leaving a paper trail. Rochelle's name was nowhere to be found. No ticket purchased, no seat assigned, no boarding record. The implication was chilling. If Rochelle never bought a ticket, then she never planned to board that bus. Which meant one of two things had to be true. Either Rochelle never made it inside the station, or she made it inside and disappeared without leaving a trace, in one of the busiest places in the city. As detectives retraced the timeline, Robert Yama's account began to feel increasingly fragile. Small details shifted. Times were vague. His recollection lacked the specificity you would expect from someone recalling the last moments with a missing person. And then there was the most uncomfortable question of all. Why was Robert Yama the one driving her? By this point, investigators were fully aware of his fixation on Rochelle. They knew about the jealous phone calls, the possessive behavior, the age gap, the emotional control, and they knew he had financed parts of her trip, a fact that made him impossible to ignore. Yet despite the growing suspicion, there was a glaring problem. There was no physical evidence, no signs of a struggle, no witnesses, no body, no crime scene. If something had happened to Rochelle, it had been done cleanly, or far away from the station, or both. As the days passed and Rochelle failed to contact anyone, the case officially shifted from a missing person to a potential foul play investigation. Flyers were distributed. Her descriptions circulated. Tips came in, but none led anywhere solid. And all the while, Robert Yama remained free. He cooperated, at least on the surface. He spoke with police. He repeated his story. He denied harming Rochelle and insisted he had no idea what happened after he dropped her off. But detectives couldn't shake the feeling that the truth was being carefully withheld. Because statistically, when a young woman disappears and one person is the last known to see her alive, the odds are overwhelming. That person matters. That person knows something. The problem was proving it. Without evidence placing Rochelle at the station or anywhere else, investigators were left chasing shadows. They couldn't even confirm the moment she was supposed to have disappeared. Had she been harmed before reaching the station? Had she been taken elsewhere after arriving? Or had the drop-off itself never occurred at all? Each possibility led back to the same name, Robert Yama. From the moment Rochelle Eam was officially listed as missing, the investigation began orbiting around a single, unavoidable truth. Robert Yama was the last known person to see her alive. In true crime, that detail alone is often enough to shape an entire case. But in Rochelle's disappearance, it became both the strongest lead investigators had and the greatest obstacle they couldn't overcome. Police began digging into Yama's background, his relationship with Rochelle, and his movements before and after July 13, 1986. What they uncovered painted a troubling psychological portrait, even if it stopped short of delivering legal proof. Yama was older, much older, and his fixation on Rochelle was no longer subtle when viewed through the lens of hindsight. Friends described him as controlling and intrusive. He monitored her social life. He resented her independence. He became jealous when she spent time with people her own age. This wasn't mutual affection. It was possession. Investigators learned that Yama had called Rochelle repeatedly during her time in Phoenix, often demanding to know who she was with and what she was doing. The calls weren't casual check-ins. They were interrogations, fueled by insecurity and entitlement. And then there was the financial aspect. Yama had purchased Rochelle's plane ticket to Phoenix. He had inserted himself into her travel plans. He knew exactly when she was supposed to leave, how she was leaving, and where she was going. That level of involvement gave him opportunity. But opportunity alone doesn't close a case. Detectives searched for physical evidence that could place Rochelle somewhere other than the Greyhound station, in Yama's vehicle, at his residence, or along a route that contradicted his story. But forensic technology in the mid-1980s was limited, and without a confirmed crime scene, there was little to test. No blood, no fibers, no witnesses. The case stalled in that frustrating gray space where suspicion is heavy, but proof is absent. Investigators interviewed Yama multiple times, watching for inconsistencies, emotional tells, or moments of pressure that might cause his story to crack. But he remained composed. He stuck to his narrative. He insisted Rochelle walked away from his car and into the station. And legally, that mattered. Without evidence proving Rochelle never entered the station, or that she was harmed elsewhere, police couldn't hold him. They couldn't search indefinitely. They couldn't arrest him on instinct alone. As weeks turned into months, Rochelle's family lived in a state of suspended grief. There was no closure, no funeral, no answers. Her parents replayed the same questions endlessly, wondering what they missed, what they could have done differently, and whether Rochelle had been trying to escape a situation that felt unsafe. Friends struggled with guilt, haunted by the idea that the warning signs had been visible but not acted upon. The most painful part was the silence. Rochelle had vanished without reaching out to anyone. No calls, no letters, no sightings, no evidence she was alive. And that silence spoke volumes. Because Rochelle had a future waiting for her. She had a job. She had goals. She had plans. People who intend to disappear don't leave their lives intact. As the investigation dragged on, leads dried up. Tips came in sporadically but went nowhere. The Greyhound station remained a dead end. And Robert Yama, despite remaining the prime suspect in the eyes of law enforcement, continued living his life without charges. The case became one of those quiet files, not closed, but not actively moving either. A name in a database. A face on a missing person poster. A question mark that refused to resolve. And then, years passed. As weeks turned into months, and months slowly dissolved into years, the disappearance of Rochelle Eames slipped into a cruel and familiar pattern, the kind that haunts families long after public attention has faded. There were no dramatic breakthroughs, No anonymous confessions. No remains discovered in the desert. Instead, there was only time. And time, in cases like this, has a way of protecting the guilty as much as it punishes the innocent. By the late 1980s, Rochelle's case had gone cold. The Phoenix Police Department kept the file open, but without new evidence or witnesses, there was little they could do. Detectives were reassigned. Leads were exhausted. The Greyhound station, once the focal point of the investigation, faded into memory as schedules changed, staff moved on, and any potential trace of Rochelle's presence disappeared along with them. For Rochelle's family, the passage of time was unbearable. They lived in a constant state of uncertainty, unable to grieve, yet unable to hope. Every phone call carried the possibility of news. Every knock at the door felt heavy with expectation. Holidays came and went, each one marked by the absence of a young woman who should have been there. They refused to believe Rochelle had simply walked away. She had loved her family. She had been excited about her career. She had plans that reached beyond the next week, the next month, the next year. Running away made no sense. But as time went on, that was one of the few explanations law enforcement could offer publicly, not because they believed it, but because they had nothing else they could prove. And through it all, Robert Yama remained a looming presence. He was never arrested, never charged, never publicly named as a suspect in a way that carried legal consequence. But behind closed doors, detectives continued to view him as the central figure in Rochelle's disappearance. The problem was that time had begun to work in his favor. Memories faded. Potential witnesses moved away. Records were lost or destroyed. And perhaps most importantly, any physical evidence that might have existed, in a car, on clothing, at an unknown location, was almost certainly gone. Yama knew this. He had survived the initial scrutiny. He had outlasted the investigation's most active phase. And as the years passed, the likelihood of him ever facing charges diminished with each calendar page turned. For Rochelle's loved ones, this reality was devastating. They watched as the man they believed was responsible for her disappearance continued his life uninterrupted. There was no trial, no courtroom, no verdict, just a quiet injustice that stretched on indefinitely. Yet the case was never forgotten entirely. From time to time, investigators revisited the file, hoping that new technology or a fresh perspective might unlock something that had been missed. But without a body, without a confession, and without evidence tying Yama directly to a crime, the case remained stuck in legal limbo. Then, in 2005, something happened that permanently altered the trajectory of Rochelle Eames' case. Robert Yama died. With his death, the last known person to see Rochelle alive took whatever he knew with him. There would be no deathbed confession, no accidental slip, no final moment of truth. The primary suspect was gone, and so was any realistic chance of prosecution. For many, this felt like the final cruelty. Because even though Rochelle's case technically remained open, justice had become impossible in the most practical sense. The one person who could explain what happened, who could confirm where she went, what she feared, or what went wrong, was no longer alive to answer. And Rochelle was still missing. When a case goes cold, silence doesn't follow. Speculation does. In the absence of answers, theories take root. Some grounded in evidence, others born from desperation, but all driven by the same human need to understand how a life can simply disappear. Rochelle Eames' case became a magnet for those unanswered questions, especially after Robert Yama's death sealed the door on direct accountability. Investigators, family members, and later true crime researchers began circling the same central issue. If Rochelle never boarded that bus, then what actually happened after she got into Yama's car that day? The first, and most widely accepted, theory is also the most disturbing. That Rochelle never made it to the Greyhound station at all. According to this theory, the drop-off was a fabrication. A story designed to place Rochelle in a public space, shifting suspicion away from Yama and onto an environment where anonymity and chaos could explain a disappearance. If Rochelle was harmed elsewhere, in Yama's car, at his residence, or at an unknown location, the bus station would serve as a perfect vanishing point. There are elements that support this idea. No one saw Rochelle inside the station. No ticket was ever purchased. No confirmed witness placed her beyond Yama's control. And critically, there was no reason Rochelle would have arrived early enough to wander off without buying a ticket. She was responsible, organized, focused on her future. The idea that she would simply abandon her belongings or leave without contacting anyone doesn't align with who she was. Another theory suggests something slightly different, but no less unsettling. That Rochelle did arrive at the station, but never intended to board the bus. Some believe she may have arranged to meet someone there, possibly to escape Yama's control, possibly to get help, or possibly to confront him indirectly. If that were the case, the station becomes a place of transition rather than departure. But this theory runs into the same problem as the others. There's no evidence. No phone records indicating a planned meeting. No witness seeing her speak to anyone. No trail leading away from the station. Which brings investigators back to the simplest explanation, the one that law enforcement often hesitates to voice publicly, but privately considers most likely. That Robert Yama, driven by obsession and a fear of losing control, confronted Rochelle on that final drive. And when he realized she was slipping away for good, he acted. Whether that confrontation escalated into violence intentionally or impulsively may never be known. But the result would have been the same. Rochelle disappears. Yama controls the narrative. The station becomes a lie that no one can disprove. What makes this theory especially compelling is the psychological profile. Yama had motive. He had opportunity. And he had a history of possessive behavior that escalated when he felt rejected. Forensic psychologists often point out that the most dangerous moment in a controlling relationship is when the victim attempts to leave. Rochelle was doing exactly that, returning to California, starting a new job, reclaiming her independence. From Yama's perspective, this may have felt like abandonment. And in cases like this, that feeling can be deadly. Still, without physical evidence, theories remain just that, educated guesses floating in a void where certainty should exist. Rochelle's family has lived with these theories for decades, turning them over in their minds, searching for the one that might finally make sense of the senseless. But none of them bring peace, because peace requires truth. And truth, in this case, died in 2005, or at least it seems that way. In true crime, it's easy for a person to slowly disappear behind the mystery of their own disappearance. They become a name on a flyer, a photo in a database, a case number discussed in forums and podcasts. But Rochelle Eam was never meant to be a mystery. She was meant to be a paralegal, a colleague, a friend who showed up on time and stayed late, a daughter who called home to share small victories. A young woman who was just beginning to understand who she was and what she wanted from the world. Those who knew Rochelle described her as thoughtful and driven, someone who didn't drift aimlessly through life, but set goals and worked toward them methodically. She had chosen a career path that required discipline and attention to detail, and she excelled at it. Her upcoming job in San Diego wasn't just employment. It was validation that her hard work mattered. She talked about the future in practical terms, where she would live, how she would support herself, what independence would look like once she no longer needed to rely on anyone else. That independence is what makes her disappearance so heartbreaking and so suspicious. Rochelle was not someone who vanished to start over. She was someone who was already starting over, and she was doing it openly, responsibly, and with excitement. Walking away from that future makes no sense unless she was forced to. Her family remembers her not as fragile, but as resilient. She was polite, yes, but not passive. She had opinions. She had boundaries. And while she may have tried to manage uncomfortable situations quietly, those close to her believe she was reaching a breaking point with Robert Yama. She wanted distance. She wanted autonomy. She wanted her life back. That desire likely made her vulnerable. Because people who are trying to leave controlling relationships often underestimate how dangerous that transition can be, especially when the other person refuses to accept it. Rochelle's attempt to step away was not loud or dramatic. It was careful, thoughtful, quiet, and that may have been what made it possible to stop her without anyone noticing. For her family, the loss was not just of a person, but of every version of Rochelle that would never exist. The professional she would have become, the friendships she would have built, the life milestones she would never reach. There were no graduations to attend, no promotions to celebrate, no chance to watch her grow older. Instead, there was only a frozen image of a 20-year-old woman, forever suspended in the moment before everything went wrong. As the years passed, Rochelle's case began to surface occasionally in media, usually as a brief segment, a paragraph in a list of unsolved disappearances. Each time, it reopened wounds for her loved ones, reminding them that while the world moved on, their loss remained unresolved. And yet, they continued to speak her name. Because as long as Rochelle Eames is remembered, her story is not finished. To understand why Rochelle Eames' disappearance remains unsolved more than 4 decades later, it's not enough to look at the people involved. You also have to look at the system that was supposed to protect her, and how, in 1986, that system was painfully limited. This was a time before digital footprints. No cell phones pinging towers. No GPS tracking. No security cameras covering every angle of a public space. If someone disappeared, investigators were often forced to rely on witness memory, paper records, and instinct. And in Rochelle's case, each of those failed at the worst possible moment. The Greyhound station, which should have been a goldmine of information, offered nothing. Surveillance technology was minimal or non-existent. Employee recollections varied, and passenger memories blurred together in the chaos of a busy travel hub. Today, a single credit card swipe or camera frame might have changed everything. In 1986, Rochelle slipped through unnoticed. There were also cultural factors at play. At the time, young adults, especially women, were often assumed to be runaways when they went missing. Police departments, stretched thin and guided by outdated assumptions, sometimes treated disappearances as voluntary unless there was immediate evidence of violence. Rochelle's age worked against her. At 20 years old, she was technically an adult. She had traveled willingly. There was no forced entry, no abandoned car, no visible struggle. That allowed doubt to creep in, doubt that delayed urgency, diluted resources, and ultimately slowed the investigation during its most critical window. Then there was Robert Yama. Despite being the last known person to see Rochelle, his role was complicated by a lack of concrete evidence. Police could suspect him, but suspicion does not meet the legal threshold for arrest. Without a body or a crime scene, prosecutors had nothing they could take to court, and so Yama remained free. Some have questioned whether investigators pushed hard enough, whether early interviews missed inconsistencies, whether a deeper dive into Yama's background might have revealed prior behavior that could establish a pattern. But hindsight is unforgiving. What's clear is that once the initial momentum was lost, it became almost impossible to regain. Each year that passed reduced the chances of finding witnesses, preserving evidence, or building a case strong enough to survive a courtroom. Rochelle's disappearance became one of those cases everyone agrees is tragic, but no one can fix. And that reality raises a difficult question. How many cases like this exist, where the truth is known privately but unprovable publicly? Cases where families live with certainty, but the justice system requires evidence that no longer exists. Rochelle Eames' case is a textbook example of how timing, assumptions, and technological limitations can align in the worst possible way. Not because no one cared, but because caring wasn't enough. Yet even now, decades later, the case still matters. Because unsolved cases are not just about the past. They're about the present, about whether lessons were learned, whether systems improved, and whether future victims will be taken seriously before they disappear. Even when a case goes cold, it never truly disappears. It lingers in filing cabinets, in family conversations spoken softly over dinner tables, and eventually, in the collective memory of strangers who stumble across a name and feel an unexpected pull toward a story that never found its ending. Rochelle Eames' disappearance is one of those echoes. For years, her case existed mostly in the background, known to law enforcement, painfully alive to her family, but largely invisible to the wider public. There were no sensational headlines, no dramatic trials, no shocking discoveries in the desert, just a quiet, unresolved absence. But in recent years, that has begun to change. As online true crime communities grew, Rochelle's story resurfaced, shared in forums, discussed in podcasts, and examined by people who had never known her, but felt compelled by the unanswered questions. The details stood out immediately. A young woman on the brink of a career, an older man with an obsessive fixation, a disappearance in broad daylight, a bus that left without her. To modern audiences, the red flags are impossible to ignore. What once might have been dismissed as unfortunate coincidence now reads like a textbook case of coercive control. The age gap, the financial leverage, the jealousy, the insistence on involvement in her movements. Today, those patterns are recognized as warning signs, indicators of risk that were not widely acknowledged in the mid-1980s. Rochelle's story has become a cautionary tale, not because she made reckless choices, but because she tried to leave quietly. And that's often when violence occurs. For her family, the renewed attention is a double-edged sword. Each retelling brings hope that someone, somewhere, might remember a detail, a face, a moment that never seemed important at the time. But it also reopens wounds that never fully healed. They have lived with unanswered questions for decades. Did she suffer? Was it quick? Did she know what was happening? Questions no family should ever have to ask, and no one left alive can answer. Robert Yama's death in 2005 closed the door on direct justice, but it did not erase suspicion. If anything, it cemented it. Many believe he escaped accountability not because he was innocent, but because time and circumstance protected him. And that belief lingers. Every discussion of the case circles back to the same conclusion, that Rochelle likely met her fate before she ever reached the Greyhound station, and that the station itself was a carefully chosen endpoint designed to explain her absence. Whether that theory is true or not, it reflects a broader truth. Rochelle Eames' disappearance was not random. It followed a pattern. It involved control, and it ended when she tried to reclaim her life. Today, her name continues to be shared, not out of morbid curiosity, but out of a desire for accountability. Because even when legal justice is no longer possible, public memory still matters. And sometimes, memory is the only form of justice left. If Rochelle Eames' disappearance teaches us anything, it's this uncomfortable truth. The most dangerous moment in a controlling relationship is not when the control begins. It's when the victim tries to leave. Rochelle didn't scream for help. She didn't accuse. She didn't make a scene. She did what countless young women are taught to do. She tried to exit gently, politely, without provoking anger. She changed her travel plans. She created distance. She focused on her future instead of confrontation. From the outside, it looked calm. From the inside, it may have felt like survival. Modern psychology has given us language that didn't exist in 1986: coercive control, emotional ownership, obsessive attachment. Today, Robert Yama's behavior would raise immediate concern. Back then, it was often dismissed as eccentric, overprotective, or simply misguided affection. That dismissal can be deadly. Rochelle's attempts to move forward threatened the one thing Yama appeared to need most: control over her. When she prepared to return to San Diego, she wasn't just traveling home. She was removing herself from his influence permanently. No more access. No more leverage. No more excuses to be involved. For someone driven by obsession, that kind of loss can feel unbearable. What makes Rochelle's case especially tragic is how invisible that danger was to the outside world. There were no restraining orders, no police reports of threats, no documented violence, just a pattern of behavior that, in hindsight, pointed toward escalation. And escalation often happens privately, in cars, behind closed doors, in moments no one else witnesses. If something happened to Rochelle, it likely happened quickly, in a confined space, under emotional pressure, with no one around to intervene. And once it was over, the silence that followed became its own kind of weapon. Because silence creates doubt, and doubt protects perpetrators. Rochelle's disappearance forces us to confront how often warning signs are minimized, especially when the victim is young, polite, and trying not to cause trouble. It challenges the assumption that danger always announces itself loudly. Sometimes, danger looks like help. A ride to the bus station, a ticket bought as a favor, a presence that's framed as concern. By the time the threat becomes obvious, it may already be too late. For Rochelle's family, this realization is devastating. They are left wondering whether stronger boundaries, louder objections, or earlier intervention could have changed the outcome. These are questions no family should have to carry. But her story also serves as a warning, one that resonates far beyond a single case. Because Rochelle Eam was not reckless. She was not naive. She was not asking for trouble. She was simply trying to live her life. Even after decades, Rochelle Eam's case remains open, a haunting reminder of what happens when suspicion is clear but evidence is scarce. While Robert Yama's death in 2005 closed the door on direct prosecution, law enforcement never officially closed the file. The case sits in the Phoenix Police Department archives, revisited occasionally, a puzzle that refuses to be solved. Investigators who worked on the file recall the frustration vividly. Every lead felt like it might crack the case open, only to fizzle into nothingness. Greyhound employees were interviewed again and again, yet none could recall seeing Rochelle. Neighbors and acquaintances were questioned, and phone records were combed over for clues that might indicate her movements, her conversations, or her intentions in the hours before she vanished. Yet the most crucial element, the moment of disappearance itself, remained a void. Without her body, without witnesses, and without tangible evidence tying Yama to a crime, the investigation was trapped in a loop. Detectives were left balancing two painful truths. The man last seen with her was suspicious beyond doubt, and yet no law could touch him. Modern investigators, revisiting the case with new technologies, sometimes hope that advances in forensic science, DNA testing, or even digital footprint reconstruction might offer answers. But in 1986, physical evidence was minimal. Any trace that might have existed on a vehicle, a personal item, or clothing would have degraded or been lost long ago. Memories of witnesses, once sharp, have blurred over time. And while new tips occasionally surface, decades of elapsed time make corroboration nearly impossible. Despite these barriers, Rochelle's family never stopped searching for answers. They followed every lead, questioned every stranger, and clung to the hope that someone, somewhere, knew something crucial. True crime forums, cold case websites, and social media pages dedicated to missing persons often carry their story forward, ensuring that Rochelle is not forgotten. The investigation, though stagnant in terms of prosecution, has become a study in the limits of law enforcement when facing an obsessive, calculating individual whose crime left almost no trace. Rochelle Eam's disappearance is a reminder that some cases are defined not by what is found, but by what is missing, not by what is proven, but by what is suspected. And yet, the lingering question persists. If Yama was responsible, as police strongly believed, why was there never a confession, a slip, or a clue to guide justice? The answer may never come, swallowed by time, death, and the meticulous absence of evidence. While the legal system struggled with evidence, The real victims of Rochelle Eames' disappearance were those who loved her. The family, her friends, and even strangers who connected with her story over time have all been shaped by the uncertainty, the grief, and the unrelenting sense of injustice. Her parents, in particular, lived through a torment that has no expiration date. Every day became a cycle of hope and despair. Each ringing phone or unexpected knock carried the fear that news might arrive, news that could either end the wait or shatter what remained. The weeks after her disappearance blurred into months, and months into years, as every holiday, birthday, and milestone came and went without Rochelle present. Every celebration was tinged with absence, every quiet moment a reminder of what was lost. Friends described her as bright, ambitious, and careful, someone who planned her future meticulously. That's why her disappearance felt so surreal. It wasn't just that she was missing. It was that her life had been interrupted at a point when it should have been flourishing. The joy of early adulthood, new beginnings, and independence was stolen, leaving only questions and echoes. Grief in these cases is compounded by the unanswered what-ifs. What if Rochelle had decided to leave a little later, or a little earlier? What if someone had spoken up about Yama's behavior sooner? What if she had boarded the bus as planned? The questions multiply because there is no definitive answer. Each possibility exists simultaneously, each one as painful as the last. And the absence of justice adds another layer of suffering. Robert Yama's death in 2005 closed any chance of legal accountability. The person many believe responsible for her disappearance never faced consequences. The family was left with suspicion, but no resolution. That lack of closure can be as devastating as the loss itself, a constant reminder that the world doesn't always right its wrongs. Yet, even in the decades of sorrow, Rochelle's family has refused to let her memory fade. They speak her name, honor her life, and continue to search for answers. Their persistence keeps her story alive, transforming personal tragedy into a call for awareness and vigilance. It reminds us all that behind every unsolved case is a human life that mattered, dreams unrealized, relationships interrupted, and a presence that cannot be replaced. Rochelle Eames' disappearance is more than a mystery. It is a cautionary tale, one that speaks to patterns of obsession, control, and the subtle ways danger can creep into everyday life. For those who study cases like hers, the story offers lessons that remain painfully relevant today. First, there is the warning about obsession disguised as care. Robert Yama's presence in Rochelle's life was framed as helpful, even generous. He bought her plane ticket. He offered rides. He called frequently, often under the pretense of concern. But beneath the surface, these gestures were mechanisms of control, creating dependence and tethering her movements to his will. In hindsight, these were the warning signs, the early indicators of possessive behavior that, if recognized and acted upon, might have prevented the tragedy. Second, the case illustrates the danger of power imbalances in personal relationships. Yama was older, financially stable, and familiar to Rochelle from her family's home. She was young, ambitious, and learning to navigate adulthood. That disparity created an invisible pressure she couldn't fully escape, and it shows how control doesn't always arrive as a dramatic confrontation. Sometimes, it builds slowly, under the guise of guidance or affection. Third, there is the chilling reminder that danger can exist in plain sight. Rochelle vanished from a busy Greyhound station, one of the last places anyone would expect a violent act to occur. The fact that she disappeared in broad daylight, surrounded by people, underscores how predators can manipulate environments and narratives to hide their actions, exploiting assumptions that public spaces are automatically safe. Finally, her story teaches the importance of listening to intuition and supporting victims of controlling relationships. Rochelle reportedly felt uneasy around Yama in the final days before her disappearance. She tried to maintain distance quietly, rather than confronting him directly. For families, friends, and communities, her disappearance is a reminder to take subtle signs seriously, to intervene, ask questions, and provide support when someone may be in a situation they cannot fully control. Rochelle's life was interrupted, but her story continues to speak, a warning for anyone willing to pay attention. It is a testament to the dangers that lurk in plain sight, the vulnerabilities of youth, and the consequences of unchecked obsession. And it is a call to action, a plea that no one should be forgotten, and that vigilance can sometimes save a life before it is too late. Rochelle Eames' disappearance remains one of those cases that refuses to settle into neat categories. There is no resolution, no final confession, no closure. There is only absence, a young woman gone in broad daylight, a prime suspect deceased, and a family who has carried the weight of uncertainty for decades. When we step back from the details, the bus that left without her, the drop-off that may never have happened, the obsessive man who loomed over her life, what remains is the haunting question at the center of it all. How does a woman vanish in a crowded station, with witnesses all around, and leave nothing behind? It's a question that refuses to be answered. It sits in the empty spaces of Greyhound's long-gone waiting rooms, in the photographs of Rochelle as a bright, ambitious 20-year-old, and in the memories of friends and family who search endlessly for signs of her life. It is a question that echoes through every discussion of her case, compelling strangers decades later to speculate, theorize, and demand justice that may never come. And yet, even without answers, Rochelle's story carries weight. It reminds us that some disappearances are not random. Some are the result of obsession, control, and the quiet, calculated ways that danger can manifest in everyday life. It teaches us vigilance, empathy, and the importance of listening, of believing someone's discomfort, of questioning the seemingly benign, of acting before it is too late. Her life, though tragically cut short, continues to resonate because people refuse to forget her. They speak her name. They share her story. They theorize, investigate, and honor her memory. Rochelle Eames was more than a missing person poster. She was a young woman on the verge of independence, a life interrupted by forces beyond her control, a person whose absence is a permanent wound to those who loved her. And while we may never know exactly what happened that July afternoon in Phoenix, one truth remains. Rochelle Eames was here. She mattered, and the world is still waiting for the story to be fully told.